representing the founder and executive director of Junction, who is currently away from Thailand. Now, before I introduce today's guest speaker, just allow me to say a few words about Junction. Junction, and you know, is a civil society organization that provides, among many other activities, a public space to discuss issues of concern about this region. And today we have the pleasure to have with us Professor Peter Jackson, from the National Australian University. Now, Professor Jackson has written extensively about this region, and today is going to share with us some of his most recent work, which includes this book that we have here, Capitalism Magic Thailand, and Deities and Divas, queer ritual specialists in Myanmar, Thailand, and beyond. And so Professor Jackson will explain to you this work, his most recent work, and he will share his insights for about 20-30 minutes. After that, we will have your questions and reflections and observations. And so, Peter, welcome.
Fabio, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Junction for inviting me this afternoon. Maybe if I stand, it's a bit better to people at the back can see me. Today is quite informal, so we'll have time for questions and discussion afterwards. But today I'll be talking about some book projects which have emerged from research that I've been doing basically for the last 5 or 6 years. My earlier work was on mainstream Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, very famous Buddhist philosopher Buddha. I also did some early work on histories of gay cultures in Thailand. About 10 or 15 years ago, I began collaborating with some NGOs here in Bangkok and noticed that people from NGOs were working with HIV education and providing interventions for gay men and transgenders. And in those collaborations, I noticed that while people had access to antiretroviral treatments for HIV assistance, many of them were accessing alternative medicine. During the week, they were accessing antiretroviral treatments provided by the Thai government or international agencies. On weekends, often they were going to spirit mediums or other folk healers from the various traditions, and they were mixing and matching these activities. And as someone who was interested in both religion and ritual and in gender diversity, I found this very interesting. And talking to colleagues, I said, is anybody doing research on the mixing and matching of folk medicine and Western medicine? No one. All the research is basically on the applicability of mainstream Western medicine for HIV issues. So the project that I worked on emerged, one aspect was that one, looking at how LGBT and trans communities in Thailand interact with alternative religious and ritual traditions. The other aspect I'm talking about today, and I've had 2 parallel streams of research over the years, I merged from mainstream Buddhism to more folk popular religion. And that happened basically during the boom years of the Thai economy. I noticed that there were a whole range of non-mainstream religious phenomena, religious movements emerging during the boom years, oriented towards wealth and making money, which seemed to be a very, very different aspect to Thai religiosity. And I began collecting information on these, what I call cults of wealth, over the years. Many of you, as you know, in the 1997, 1998, there was a massive economic crisis in this region, the Asian economic crisis. Many of these new religious movements emerged during the boom years, associated with making money, using religion and ritual to become wealthy. Following Max Weber, the more modern, the more whatever society, the less religious, the less the less enchanted. My working assumption was that during a downturn of an economy that these new wealth movements would disappear. And they did disappear for a little while. But within 18 months or so, many of these movements oriented towards wealth, and I'll show you some pictures in a minute, re-emerged very, very quickly, even as the Thai economy was still recovering from the downturn of the economic period. And so my initial assumptions that these were like flash-in-the-pan movements, that they would just emerge during boom years and then disappear during economic crisis, went out the window. I had to rethink my thought about what's going on with popular religion in this country, where through both boom and bust, new religious movements oriented towards a whole range of very diverse deities and spiritual figures, oriented towards wealth, can survive through all sorts of economic conditions and maintain their emphasis on wealth. So anyway, just as a bit more background, unfortunately this is the book that is oriented, it's basically reporting my research on what I'm calling cults of wealth. It was published by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore last year. And unfortunately, their distribution in Bangkok isn't as good as it might be, so it's a little bit hard to find, the English edition. But if you contact the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, I'm sure that you'll be able to get a copy fairly easily, and I'm going to try to push them to make it more easily available in the English version. I need to thank Matichon Books for providing a Thai translation earlier this year. So for those who are Thai readers, this is Capitalism Magic Thailand in Thai. First of all, I've had a major book published in Thai, which is a nice feeling. And Matichon's done a very good job, so I need to thank Matichon Books for all the work that they put into this as well. Just briefly, Max Weber, we just spoke about, very famous sociology religion figure. I don't need to talk about it too much, but working basically in the 1920s, early 20th century, a major figure in the sociology of religion. Even though his work was almost 100 years old, he's still amazingly influential in a whole range of fields. So the working assumption still in much of mainstream sociology of religion in Western universities is that disenchantment, that is the more modern, the more wealthy, the more scientific a society is, the less spirituality, less popular enchantment, supernatural phenomena. In some senses, this is true of Northern Europe. In a sense, the Northern European countries basically follow the Max Weber line. But it doesn't work in Southeast Asia. And so there's a lot of work has assumed the Weber theory and have tried to apply it in Southeast Asia, and it just hasn't worked. So my book, in a sense, is to engage that. Basically, I'm critiquing mainstream Western sociology of religion, which is still dominated by a lot of work in Western Europe, which tend to apply models in Asia which just don't work, and say, well, yes, we need to engage that thought, but it's not really working in this region. Weber was wrong, at least in Thailand, in the context of capitalist modernity, both through boom and bust. We've seen a whole range of new cults. I'll show you some images. Some of these are cults that are directly towards making money. Other cults are of magic monks called Geji Ajahn in Thai, who bless amulets. Those of you who know Thailand know that amulets are very, very important in this country. There's also been a growth in spirit possession cults. I'll talk about that in a minute as well. So I'm looking at all of these diverse phenomena as an overall situation. Just an example, what are the spirits of wealth in Thailand? These are some which were very popular during the boom years and the early 2000s. So there's a whole range of cults of Hindu deities. Yes, Thailand has had Hindu influences for millennia, but many of these deities have new cults which do not exist in their current form. So, for example, the cult of Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, has really emerged in a major way in the last 20 years in a way which didn't exist before. We also have cults of Chinese Mahayana Buddhism, bodhisattvas, Kuan Yin, emperor gods, heroes from Thai history, King Chulalongkorn, also a cult of wealth around him. Some people say, well, Peter, maybe this is just peripheral, these are just minor things. These are things that people on the margins of society are interested in. And I say, well, maybe, but not only. And my argument is I'm basically a historian, so I'm not going out to the field, I'm not fully trained sociologist or anthropologist. I'm interested in how basically writings and representations are represented. I'm also a stamp collector. And I want to argue that images or photos that get put on stamps are not just any old images. Stamps are published by state agencies. In order for an image to be on a national stamp, it has to pass a whole range of official criteria. And in Thailand, there would have been a whole range of very conservative cultural figures. So the Thai Post Office, in choosing images for its postage stamps, is it's following what will sell at the post office, but its images must be passing certain criteria within cultural agencies in Thailand, so they're not controversial. You hardly ever get controversial images on postage stamps, put it that way, because you can imagine what would happen if something like that. There would be a whole range of issues. So postage stamps are safe, conservative cultural representations of national images. In 2009 was the first time ever in history of over 100 years of Thai stamps. We've had many images of Buddha, of Buddhist temples in Thai. It was the first time we had images of Hindu deities. And not just one, we had 4 major deities: Ganesh, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So the first time that this was ever happened, and I take this as an indication of the rise of cults of Hindu deities at the national level, that it's safe, so safe to talk about this, that even postage stamps now have Hindu deities. In the same year was the first time that a Chinese Mahayana Bodhisattva appeared on a Thai stamp, Guan Yin. And the cult of Guan Yin is very, very popular amongst many people in Thailand. Yes, amongst the Chinese Thais, Sino Thais, but even beyond that region as well. So I just want to point out that the Thai Post Office is also very aware of the magical implications of numbers and colours and these sorts of things. So the first stamp for Guan Yin, Jamat Guan Yin, was released on the 9th of September 2009, and it was valued at 9 baht. So gao, 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 gao. And if any of you know about the word gao in Thai, will know that this is a quite important word in a whole range of dimensions. It's a multi-meaning word. But it's very close to the Thai word for progress, in addition to meaning the word for 9. And there are a whole range of cults which emphasize magic numerals around numerology. So here we have the Thai Post Office not only for the first time publishing a Chinese deity, but also following Thai numerology, so that the people who buy the stamps know these sorts of issues. So the magicality of the stamp is enhanced by the numerological implications of this issue as well. 2008 was an anniversary of the equestrian statue, 100th anniversary of the equestrian statue of King Chulalongkorn down in the Royal Plaza. And of course there were a whole range of issues around that. Back in the early 1910s, there's a whole series of stamps of the King Chulalongkorn equestrian statue. And so the image of that stamp was reproduced for the 100th anniversary. This is the 5 baht issue. I mean, King Chulalongkorn was King Rama V, so having 5 baht for King Rama V was another numerological association. King Chulalongkorn was born on a Tuesday, and in Thai astrology, the day of the week is important. And each day of the week has an auspicious colour. And for those who are born on Tuesday, pink is the auspicious colour. And so the cult of King Chulalongkorn will always emphasise the colour pink. So here we have the 5 baht stamp for the 100th anniversary of the equestrian statue of King Chulalongkorn with a pink background. I mean, there was nothing pink about the equestrian statue, but having a pink background was part of the way that the Thai Post Office is giving indications to those on the inside, to those who know Thai magic and Thai astrology, etc., that this was another indication. In a sense, I use this stamp as an indication of like a official imprimatur, that the magic cult of King Chulalongkorn had received official approval at this stage. Just going on, the book I'm talking about, Capitalism Magic Thailand, inviting Thai editions are for sale there as well. I was told to promote it for sale. That in addition to these figures, we also have the cult of amulets, which is very, very popular and famous in Thailand, where magic monks bless or chant over amulets to empower them, to give them magical authority. This is something that's been happening in Thailand for well over 100 years, so there's nothing new about that. But there's been a major transformation, I would argue, in the cult of amulets. In that, one, the monks who are renowned to have blessed amulets have cults around them as well. This was a poster that was very popular during the height of the boom, economic boom in the late 1990s. And it is an image of 3 famous Thai monks. And I don't think they ever met in real life. But one's Reverend Father Chaw, one's Reverend Father Nun, one's Reverend Father Sok. And when you happen to put their names together, it makes a sentence in Thai which literally translates as, I like cash. Chaw Nun Sok. It's a Thai sentence which means I like cash, or I like money. Or I like cash actually. So this was a cult. Here we have monks whose amulets are very important. And we have a cultic image. I bought this at Judge Market, by the way, so you can. My site of research has moved from temples to marketplaces, so Judge's been very important for my research over the years. So I bought this in 1997. And this image was very, very popular. You could see that around back in the late 90s, early 2000s. You would find it often in the backs of West shops, whatever, where you often see the image of Nam Quak, the welcoming goddess who brings in customers. You would often see an image like this as well attached to those sorts of Hindu char or worship shells in Thailand. Another famous magic monk of the late 90s and early 2000s was Reverend Lumpok Kun, whose name literally means Reverend Father Multiply. That's actually his name. And his cult, became very, very famous during the 1990s for basically blessing a massive array of amulets. They were His temple, which is in Rajasima, up in Korat, was a centre of major pilgrimage. While he was still alive, he died about 10 years ago, I forgot exactly, a bit less than a decade ago. But he was very, very famous, very, very popular in that period. And this image basically is what began my interest in cults of wealth. So I was shopping, just as people do, in Judge Market on the weekend, and on the footpath, on the pavement, I thought it looked like money. Someone's selling money. How can you sell money? I thought. And it wasn't money, it was these are called lucky banknotes. So these were produced by Reverend Father Multiply's Lumpok monastery, and people were out selling them. You could buy them for 50 baht or 60 baht or whatever in Bangkok. I just found them fascinating because the diverse images. Here we have Reverend Father Multiply himself. He's squatting down. He was very famous for his very folksy language. He was very, very Ban Nok, very, very rural monk, just squatting down, and he's holding wads of banknotes. We have an image of King Jolongkon up here. We've got Reverend Father's I Like Money up in that corner there. We've got a katha or incantation for wealth and everything else. And we've got, I think it was 1996. I think it was it Lumpok 72nd birthday, I've forgotten the occasion. But anyway, it was an occasion where the Thai army flew then King Bhumibol and Queen Sirikit to Wat Ban Rai, the monastery of Lumpok Kun, so that Lumpok Kun could meet them, and that he donated, I think it was 90 million baht to the king's projects. So his monastery was bringing in massive amounts of money from the sale of amulets, from other religious regalia, and he was doing a whole lot of welfare projects on Rajasima, including supporting royal projects. There were questions around the legitimacy of this type of phenomenon in the mid-90s. There were critiques around it. But one found that as soon as King Bhumibol visited the monastery, these critiques died away. And one found that these sorts of images of King Bhumibol together with Lumpok Kun were popular all around the country around this time, in a sense giving an official imprimatur to the cult of this particular monk. Just more magic amulets on Thai stamps you can do, there were just oodles of them. About 10 or 15 years ago, the Thai post office were just producing series after series of stamps with amulets. This one was interesting because they sold it, not simply, these are images of important, historically important amulets in Thailand called Benchapaki, 5 important stamps. But in addition to just having images of the amulets, the little poster, what's called a stamp, was actually sold with gold leaf. Those of you who know rituals in Thailand know that Buddha images often have gold leaf attached to it. So they're often applying gold leaf to an image of a religious spiritual figure is part of the devotional ritual. So the Thai post office sold, not the amulets, the Thai post office sold stamps with images of amulets, and the images of the amulets had gold leaf attached to it. So we have images of religious icons, which even the images of religious becoming religious icons. And it was sold, when it first issued on the 11th of November 2011. 11 is not usually a very auspicious numerological number, but 11, 11, 11 was just something to go along with the yoga. Moving on to the second element of my book is looking at growth of rituals of spirit possession. In the last 30, 40, 50 years or so, yes, spirit possession has been across mainland Southeast Asia, as far as we know. But research until about the 1990s, work by anthropologists back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, university was reporting, at least in Thailand, that rituals of spirit possession were in decline. Until the 1990s, when something different happens, and suddenly people would go into trance who were possessed by various deities and speak in trance, people consult the deities through the trance medium. This type of ritual began to increase again. And it moved from rural villages, which were traditionally cyber spirit possession rituals, to cities, from working class to middle class. So the expansion in cults of spirit possession relocated from villages to cities. They had a transformation from being rural and working class to middle class, and a whole range of new deities were involved, so that when the cults of spirit possession were taking place, it wasn't ancestor spirits as much anymore who were being consulted. It was often the deities of the cults of wealth. So we had spirit mediums of Ganesh, Hindu deities, spirit mediums of King Chulalongkorn, spirit mediums of other historical figures from Thai history, these sorts of issues. So the figures that I was looking at in terms of cults of wealth, I was also finding again in another location in spirit possession rituals. So I was finding amulets for these cults, and then down the road there would be a spirit medium who was also going into a trance, speaking in the voice of Ganesh, or speaking in the voice of King Chulalongkorn, and being consulted by middle class followers, seeking to get advice on will their child pass their exams, or should we invest in this share or that share, or what should I do for my business to succeed? They're asking all these sorts of very, very contemporary questions. I did a whole collaborative project with colleagues in France and Europe and in Thailand, and the book Spirit Possession in Buddhist Southeast Asia was produced last year, bringing together. I won't have time to talk about it today, but the phenomenon of the growth of rituals of spirit possession, it's not simply a Thai phenomenon. It's happening in Vietnam, it's happening in Myanmar, it's happening in Cambodia, and it may well be happening in Laos, but I don't really have any information. So all across what we might call Buddhist mainland Southeast Asia, over the same period, the last 40 years or so, there's been a major growth in rituals of spirit possession, where the orientation of the consultation with spirits is for success. People who are followers of the spirits are looking for advice on how they can be successful in the new economy, in the new world, whether it's success in education or in business or whatever. And what's interesting is that these sorts of phenomena in the past were often oriented towards protection from enemies, or in a sense providing sources of protection from evil influences. The element of protection from evil influences is not as prominent anymore. The whole orientation is now success and wealth. So the orientation of this population has moved dramatically in a whole range of ways. The other element along this, which is like the third dimension which I'm talking about today, is that at the same time as we've had cults of wealth emerging with new pantheons of deities, there are new pantheons in Vietnam as well and in Burma as well. So new sets of deities are emerging, oriented towards success and wealth, with new forms of rituals around spirit possession happening in urban areas. At the same time, the ritual specialists of this are also, there's also a gender cultural transformation taking place as well. In Thailand, in the earlier period, pre-modern period, with spirit possession rituals, it was often older women in villages who were the mediums, and often they were mediums for ancestor spirits of the village. What we found in the same time that these cults of wealth have emerged and then spirit possession has moved from villages to the cities, more and more gender diverse spirit mediums have entered the scene. There has always been a minority of spirit mediums who have been gender diverse, transgender or gay, even before the word existed. And the anthropological literature often usually cites a small number of these gender diverse people as spirit mediums. But the anthropological literature that I've read that's working on Thailand and Burma from the 1960s to the 1970s universally only recites queer or gender diverse mediums in footnotes. They're never the major element of the research project. That they may be present, But at least according to the anthropologists who were doing research in the 60s and 70s in Thailand and Burma and elsewhere, gender diverse mediums were a much small minority, no more than 5 or 10%. Whereas these days what we're finding is that across the region, that the numbers of medians who are gender diverse, whether in their identity as trans or gay, whatever, is sometimes reaching 50% or more of the medians in a particular region or area. So the number of gender diverse medians is increasing dramatically. So my argument is not that there have never been gender diverse medians. My argument is that something's happened to make their role increase at the same time that they are being medians for new pantheons of deities. And these new pantheons are oriented towards wealth and success in a new modern urban capitalist economy. So that's the broad set of issues that I'm looking at. I'm looking at a whole range of different issues, and the different books have in a sense focused on different things. So the Magic Capitalism Magic Thailand has basically looked at the cults of wealth in their broad aspects. The previous one I showed you is basically looking at the comparative issue that across the region, comparatively in Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, and Cambodia, without any apparent connection between these cults, the same phenomenon is taking place. That spirit possession cults have emerged in all these countries across the same historical period, with new pantheons and with gender diverse people at the center of these cults as well. So something very interesting at a cultural level is taking place across the whole region. It isn't that Vietnam is borrowing from Thailand or Thailand is borrowing from Cambodia or whatever. There are connections through tourism, but something at a much deeper, interesting cultural level is taking place, and that's what I'm more interested in.
You mean that there are no influences across borders?
There are, but I'm not arguing that it's the only influence making this happen. That in a sense, the influences across the borders are coming after these cults have emerged. So, for example, Oscar Salamik has been working on spirit cults in Vietnam. Argues that many transgender spirit mediums in Vietnam are coming to Thailand for the gender reassignment surgery, and so they come to Thailand to become feminized, and so they come in contact with Thai cults when they're here, but they're not coming here in order, in a sense, to learn how to be spirit mediums. They already are spirit mediums in Vietnam. They're becoming, in a sense, they're participating in the gender reassignment surgery which is available in this country. So these are the people who are writing various chapters in the Deities and Divas book. We've got a number on Thailand, a couple on Burma and Vietnam. So I just want to put that there. Time's moving on, we want to have time. So I will show you some images, to give you some pictures. These are some images from the festival of the Nine Emperor Gods, or often called the Chinese Vegetarian Festival, which is very popular in Phuket in the south of Thailand. These are images from Krabi province. Many of the urban areas have these street parades of spirit mediums in the Chinese Vegetarian Festival. One often finds amongst the images of the young men, often we find these very extreme images of people piercing themselves in these types of rituals. One also finds transgender mediums at one end. So that in the midst of all of these very masculine presentations, and the young men are often mediums for Chinese warrior deities, or Taoist warrior deities. We also find transgender mediums at one end that have the same element. So I'm just giving images across the region where we're finding this phenomenon taking place. I need to thank Dr. Dredge Khan for this image. Everybody did comment that this was someone of Dredge's work a decade ago. This is of a gay identified medium in suburban Bangkok, who was a medium of the Hindu deity Vishnu, doing a ritual in a middle-class house in Bangkok to give an indication of these phenomena. And this was a transgender performer as part of the same ritual group. But I want this to be an indication of that there are a whole range of diversely identified people performing in these rituals in urban locations these days in a very interesting way. What's interesting is that transgender and gay people are not only the spirit mediums in these rituals, often they're forming part of a wider network. So the mediums often have a boriwat of a group of followers. And they're often these days they're often commercial in the sense that you need to engage and pay for a medium to come and perform the ritual. So you not only engage the medium, you engage somebody to prepare the flowers, to prepare the altar, to make sure that the dances are performed to entertain the deities in the correct way, so that for the deities to come to earth, they need to be entertained correctly, so that dance performances are often very important. And so the aesthetics of ritual are very, very important as part of this phenomenon. So there are often a whole range of trans or gay people in the followers of mediums whose task it often is to do the aesthetic element of the rituals, to prepare the flowers, to prepare the shrines, to dance the performances, etc. This is also the case in state internet. So this was the street parade of mediums in Krabi province in the Chinese Vegetarian Festival a few years ago, 5 more minutes. So that even state agencies are engaging transgender people to be, in a sense, carry the banners of the names of the shrines along the street. So the element of transgenders being pretty and beautiful to provide a sense of aesthetic element to the ritual element is a very, very important element of the phenomenon going on as well. Okay, time's running along. There's been whole critiques of this. It hasn't happened without criticism. These critiques have been, there's a Thai term called Puttapanit, literally commerce in Buddhism or commodified Buddhism, which is a put down word, it's a criticism. So there's been very intense critiques of Puttapanit, the phenomenon that I've been talking about here, in a whole range of domains among educated, middle class people. But despite the critiques, it hasn't had any impact. The critiques are out there at a level of discourse, but there's been no law to stop this, there's no intervention to prevent it. Yes, there's a discursive criticism. It's, people say it's superstitious, it's just an accretion to true Buddhism, whatever, but the people who engage in this really don't seem to listen very much. So there is a disconnect between the criticisms, which are very intense, and the actual phenomena itself. So unlike the situation perhaps in contemporary Malaysia or Indonesia, where there are spirit doctors, etc., but where reformist Islam has political power, these type of phenomena are, in a sense, much less visible in Malaysia and Indonesia than maybe they were 10 or 15 years ago because of the political strength of reformist Islam. Whereas in Thailand, reformist Buddhism hasn't had the same political power to intervene in the same way. It's just as reformist Buddhism is just as critical of these phenomena, but it doesn't have the political power to implement that critique at the everyday level. This was the mark I did my PhD on, is very, very critical of spirit mediums, etc. So, I mean, I began with more mainstream doctrinal Buddhism, and I moved into cult since then. Just to finish off, what's going on? Why is modernity making magic in 21st century Thailand? I don't have a single answer. I think the answer is still waiting out there for us. But it's really, and also why are more gay men and trans women becoming spirit mediums? My other big question. Why, back to magic and modernity, there have been three main sets of answers by different people on this article presented. Capitalism, media, and official support for these types of cults. So the anthropologists Jean and John Komarov, who are very, very influential in international anthropology, have argued that neoliberal capitalism has a close parallel to the structure of what they call occult economies. I don't want to go into detail, but they're arguing that there's a cultural parallel between cults of wealth, not only in Thailand, but in South Africa and other parts of the world, and the phenomenon of neoliberal capitalism. Moving from capitalism as oriented in David's day, oriented on production, to capitalism oriented towards consumption and finance. And the two Komarovs, working as a husband and wife team, argued that the transformation of capitalism from its orientation on production to its orientation to finance and consumption has had dramatic cultural impact on the domain of religion, which in a sense has provided one of the foundations for this type of phenomenon to emerge. Another completely different line of argument is coming from media studies. And another anthropologist working on Rosalind Morris, who looked at spirit cults emerging in northern Thailand, argued that when new visual media like photography or cinema or whatever first emerged, they were often taken as representing reality. When photography emerged in the 19th century, said, oh, now we get a real picture of reality. You can't argue with a photograph. Whereas if we look at the internet, the whole debate since Trump, since whatever, is about fake news. That we can't trust the internet, we can't trust media. That the whole AI debate that's happening at the present time, that media has moved beyond reality to represent whatever. So that the argument is that as media has, in its new forms, has moved beyond representations of inverted commas reality, it can intersect more with notions and beliefs in the supernatural, in the sense that people argue that there's been a spectralization of the media domain, so that there's, in a sense, less opposition from media to representing this type of phenomena. People have argued the same phenomena in India as well, where Indian anthropologist Mukherjee argued that mass media in Thailand made the Hindu gods more real. The particular importance of Hindu gods, for politics in country India, if you follow the situation in India, is partly a result of their media representation. Media images, the Ramayana, TV stories of Bhagavad Gita, TV stories of Vishnu, etc. These sorts of TV images often have been sold in Thailand by popular as well. But this mediatization has made Hindu religion, Hindu representations, even more prominent than they were in the past. Just to finish off quickly, mainstream support. So this is on the current but still serving Prime Minister until we have another Prime Minister. I think it was about at a news conference, he was going to go to Russia in 2016 to meet Putin. He was asked, are you afraid of meeting Putin? He's a very tough character. And the Prime Minister said, no, I'm not afraid of Putin, I've got protection. And he opened his shirt and showed his collection of amulets that were protecting him for his visit to Russia. Just to finish off, moving on quickly, lots of why are more gay and trans women becoming spirit mediums? Good question. I think there's a whole range of answers, not just one thing. One is social acceptance. I think that the fact that queer people are more socially accepted means that they can now interact in a whole range of other domains. They're not limited to traditional roles. So simply being more widely accepted means that they can move from being minoritized and to be more respected in other areas. Another element I think is more structural is that the cults of wealth and spirit cults I'm talking about, and also new queer spiritual, queer cultures in Thailand, both emerged outside of mainstream culture in the marketplace. So the cults of wealth are outside Buddhist monasteries, often in the marketplace, whereas Thailand's queer culture, gay and transgender culture, has had zero state support. It's emerged in the only place where you could have sort of gay people 20, 30 years ago was in gay bars. So that the space of commercial venues has been extremely important in providing a space within society where people of diverse genders and sexualities would come together for the first time. So not only is this new religious phenomenon of the marketplace, queer people in Thailand have emerged in the space of the market as well. And this is a phenomenon across the world. In a sense, gay cultures emerged in the modern era in commercial spaces because they had opposition within the state laws, etc., state institutions, or anti-queer. The only place that people could get together was in the marketplace, forming their own venues, opening their own pubs or bars, etc. So there's a parallel between the marketplace influences on these cults of wealth and queer cultures as well. Capitalism media. Another interesting phenomenon, I've been doing more research in the last couple of years with Thai colleagues. In some places in Thailand where village rituals or spirit meetings were taking place in the past by older women, many women have moved out of the villages to go to work in Bangkok or in factories or for education, so that the female ritual specialists often are not available anymore in the villages. But those who are left in the villages often still want to perform the rituals. So the question is, who's going to do the ritual for us if the old lady down the road is now living in Bangkok? And what has happened is that queer people have moved into this space, so they're often engaged now, they're brought in to pay, they're paid to do the rituals. And they're being very entrepreneurial in places like northern Thailand, northeast Thailand, where often these groups of ritual specialists move around from village to village, being engaged by local villagers to do local rituals, to engage with local deities. A final point, and I'll finish now, is that the connection between performance and aesthetics. I mentioned earlier that queer people and these rituals, the aesthetic element is really important in the flowers, in the design of the shrines, in the performance of the body, in dancing. Dance is and singing, so the elements of this are very important. It struck me that this element of performance has close parallels to drag queen performances. That the drag queen performance, or divas is the word that we use for drag queens who perform Madonna or Beyonce or whatever. They're embodying these famous female performers. So that the embodiment of performance on the drag stage and in the spirit stage as well has, of course, I'm not saying that Madonna is a deity, but performatively, if you're looking at the level of what's going on in front of your eyes, if you're an anthropologist or sociologist, what's going in front of your eyes when you go to a drag performance and when you go to a spirit performance looks superficially very similar. There's an extreme aesthetic element. People who are born male are embodying the female. There's a whole range of speaking that people who are speaking the voice of Madonna through whatever, they're speaking the voice of the deity. One can find a whole range of interesting structural parallels taking place at this level. And I think, I don't go into this in great detail in the book, in Deities and Divas, but I think there's a future project to be done that could very interestingly compare drag performances and also the aesthetic element of spirit possession. And that would take a very interesting direction. So I'll just finish that very briefly, but I've done a very Cook's tour. But there's a whole range of fascinating phenomena happening, not just in Thailand, but across the region, where capitalism, media, gender transformations are all taking place in very interesting and diverse ways. And I think we need to bring new ways of looking and thinking about this to understand what's going on, to appreciate that in detail. So sorry for going over time, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now, we are going to open to your questions, comments, observations. As an established process here at Junction, we are going to take questions in clusters of 3 at a time. We'll see how many rounds we can have because we have to finish at 6 p.m. So I think we have some mics that are available. Please, anyone who would like to? Yes? If you kindly could just introduce yourself by your first name.
Hi, I'm Ami. I did Thai studies in Shula. I'm not a full-time academic, I'm a businessman, but that's my passion. I have two questions. One regarding the identity of the media, the mediums, in terms of the gay and the trans. Is the fact that they are a bit outside of the full conventions of society, like qualifies them more to take this not as supposedly dying kind of practice? Do you think that's part of it? That's question number one. Question number two concerns your book and the claim which I read, and the Capitalism Magic. You'll have to sign it for me too. And whether your claim that modernism brings both, is both, I don't know, if born of rationalism and magic, would you agree that it's not linked to rationality, science, and magic through the same sides of the process? I mean, I would have thought that it's linked to rationalism and science at its impulse level, but it's more linked to magic, like what exactly you mentioned. You mentioned also in the book. There's spectralization, more in terms of the effects that modernization has created through science and technology.
Thank you. Any other questions for this first round?
Hi, thank you so much. My name's Al. I am going to my 4th year PhD in anthropology at Yale. So I'm curious here, trying to pull those two questions at the end together between your two projects. I'm wondering, in the last 30 years, has the view of gender by the monastic kind of community shifted as well? Because you're on one hand talking about the shift in broader marketplace, but I'm curious, in the monastic community, has that doubled down into a stronger dichotomization of gender, or has there been kind of more gender, kind of like a wider diverse gender And also not to be monolithic about the monastic community, but also like who and how. I'm just curious if you can elaborate more on just kind of giving a little bit of a picture as to how that shifted or not in the last 30 years. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this is a simple, straightforward question, but just with this last slide here, are there a lot of spirit mediums that are also doing drag? Just out of curiosity.
Maybe I don't know. It's possible. I'll go back to this question first. Your first question, yes, it's very interesting because your question is interesting because comparatively there's been research on ritual cults and gender diverse people, perhaps in Indonesia, for example, and the Bisu in Sulawesi are a very well-known situation. The argument there is that their gender diverse status, in a sense, qualifies them more to they're outside the norm, and therefore, in some sense, they are in contact with other things that are outside the norm. If you're outside the norm gender-wise, then maybe you're in contact with things that are outside the norm spiritual-wise. I think that's been argued for Indonesia, for example. Haven't found that in Thailand. So I mean, my earlier work on the lesbian, gay, and trans history in Thailand, the people who are called Katoi, the word that I maybe work for now means trans. It's a derogatory word until very recently, So people who were labelled Katoi were completely minoritized. They were not, in a sense, given any special status. They were, in a sense, the opposite of that. They were stigmatized. Some of them may have been mediums in some situations, but I have not found in the research any belief in that being a Katoi in the past gave one special access to the religious or spiritual domain. In a sense, it all seems to be the opposite, that being a Katoi excluded one from whatever. Being a proper person, being a proper man, or whatever. So the transformation that's taken place in Thailand, it seems to be much even more dramatic, that for people to claim, for trans or gay identified people to become ritual specialists and to be honoured for that is a dramatic change. So rather than being seen as stigmatised for their gender status, yes, their gender status maybe is not immediately relevant to whether they are mediums or not, but they can achieve social honour and respect in that role as well. So I think that's the situation that's going on there. So I know the question's really interesting and I think it's an important one, and I've been looking for it, but I haven't really found anyone arguing that being gay or Katoi makes you closer to Ganesh, or closer to Guan Yin, or to King Chulalongkorn. You can be gay Katoi and be in contact with these spirits, but being gay Katoi is a special criterion. And they're not only gay Katoi mediums, I mean, there are some cisgendered men and women as well, so I'm not arguing that they're taken over completely, but there's something interesting else that's going on as well.
I was just wondering, being different, they can slip through the cracks of reality.
It's possible, but it hasn't really been a dominant element in local understandings. I mean, maybe we could make that argument, but in a sense, in Indonesia, the argument that the Bisu were gender different, gaining access to the spiritual domain was something that people knew. You could go talk to people in Sulawesi, they would tell you that. Whereas if you go to villages in Thailand, they don't tell you that about Katoi. They're not saying that Katoi have access to this because they're Katoi. On your other question, I think that's also very interesting, and I think that the question of what is the relationship between like Weber's theory, etc., and what's going on the ground. And there's more work being done with theories of secularization, for example, that religion would become removed from the political domain and just become more privatized. Whereas people have often argued that even in Western Europe and Northern Europe, the sector of society which is the most secularized and the most disenchanted is the academics who are talking about this theory. And that you can go to Germany and you can go to other places and find various forms of local cults or rituals or magic, not this type but of local forms at the everyday level, which are just existing there. So I think there's a mismatch between the level of theory of disenchantment, the theory of secularization, and what actually is taking place sociologically on the ground, even in Western societies. Where people could argue that, having an astrology page or a newspaper is still superstition, but it's still there in every country in the world, So there's, maybe Weber was only looking at one dimension of the phenomena, rather than everything else on the ground. Alice?
Sorry, just if we can stay on your question before we move, if I may, but going back to this issue of the social acceptance that we're talking about, in your research or in other research you're aware of, is there any consideration about socioeconomic status, class? Because I think that's often overlooked, in terms of not all transgender people, but all the same in terms of the opportunity they can have for social. So I don't know if you...
I think the more that a trans person can conform to bourgeois, middle class, upper class ideals of feminine beauty, then the more they're likely to be accepted by the wider society. Even within the trans community itself, there is a range of terms that describe people of various levels of how successfully they embody the feminine. And if you still have a very heavy built muscular male body, even though you're trying to be a drag queen, then that can be criticized or whatever as well. So I think the element of class, which is not just simply about class background, but the performance of class-based ideals of gender. So if we might think of what it is to be a proper woman, or what's the, etc., in the way that the Thai media presents that. I mean, Thailand is a society which seems to have a non-ending stream of beauty contests, or even handsome man contests, so that it's this society seems to have a fascination with beauty. But the type of beauty that is on the stage for these contests is a particular type of beauty. It's a very modern form of the feminine physique, the feminine body, the feminine face, etc. And it's a very, it takes money to be beautiful, it costs, and so that, at least in that way. So that, there's a class element to this. There really has been limited research on the class background of trans gay people themselves, which is interesting. I mean, I only anecdotally that people often from more upper class backgrounds or middle class backgrounds may, in the past, have been more difficult to come out as trans because they were expected to conform to what a son should do, for example, these sorts of things. But I think there's a whole project to be done on the element of class and queer identity in Thailand. Al's question, I really don't have a clear answer, Al. There's been a whole lot of debates and criticism in the last decade or more of effeminate monks, monks who've been ordained as monks, but who act in a very feminine way once they become monks. There seems to be diverse responses to this. Like, I'm actually working with somebody who's doing research on that in northern Thailand at the moment. And they're from the northern Thailand, and they don't have a comparison view elsewhere, but they seem to say that some places in the north, maybe not in the urban centres of Chiang Mai, but maybe in the rural areas where gender performance is not as important, in terms of where you're being a bit effeminate as if you're a monk or whatever. So there seems to be very diverse attitudes towards this. It also depends on how much it gets into the media. So that if there's a particular scandal or whatever, I mean, this monastery has a whole bunch of very, very camp monks, and they're having a birthday party on a raft in a lake or something like that. There was something like that happened 10 or 15 years ago where Thai Rata or Daily News makes the front page. Then things happen. But that's the case with everything in Thailand. A lot of things can happen if they don't get the front page of the media or make it onto TV, then they can happen. So whereas if they get onto the front page of the papers, even if people are letting them happen normally, that becomes very problematic. So often there's the mediatization issue becomes an element there. But I think it's a whole project to be done on gender and gendering, and I don't know whether the Thai monkhood has become more gender binary, forcing proper male or masculine roles. I really don't know the answer to that. Just a question. And I really don't know. Maybe there are. Maybe when spirit mediums have time off, are they drag queens? I don't know. Maybe when drag queens don't have their time off, are they spirit mediums? Interesting observation to think about that.
Thank you, Peter. So we can have another cluster of 3 questions. Anyone would like to ask or comments or observations?
There is an online question which I will ask. Is from is there so special what he said is that, "Hi, Professor Peter. I wish I could attend the talk in person, but I'm not in Bangkok today. I'm curious to know your thoughts on emerging Thai queer cultures at the age of marriage, equality activism, and gender non-conforming identities. How do they fit in the trajectory in the Thai queer history and the implications of such emergence for Thai queer study? Thank you so much."
Interesting question. I think there's been interesting transformation in the last few years, particularly during the COVID era. I mean, one of the things I had a book, edited collection that I edited back in 2011 called Queer Bangkok, where I argued that while gay spaces, gay venues, Thailand's gay culture and trans culture had emerged within commercial spaces, but there really hadn't been a strong political or queer rights movement. And there have been some that were very minor. And I think that's no longer the case. I think we've seen the last few years a quite explicit and quite public marriage equality, gender equality, trans recognition, changing of the right of trans-identified people to change their pronoun, or to change their title from Mr. to Ms. These sorts of issues have all become, in a sense, out there in the mainstream of public debate and discourse. And it seems to me that a lot of this began to happen around the same time, well, this movement of a much more explicit gay rights discourse and much more political mobilization visible on the streets happened around the same time. I don't know whether it was coincidental, but it was often seemed to be related to the student demonstrations that happened in 2000, 2001. For those of you who were here who were following the news, that in the early years of the COVID period, there was a whole lot of debates and a whole lot of student movements coming out publicly that began the opposition much more publicly to the anti-112 debates, for example, where students from Thammasat University were going on stage and for the first time in that period, calling out for division of 112, etc. And it was in the context of those sorts of street demonstrations that I noticed that more and more queer people were getting involved. That at the same time there might be a demonstration for a mainstream political issue, there'd be a queer contingent. And it was the first time that I also saw Thai or various political parties having queer flags attached to their political movements as well. And it's in the context of the most recent election in May this year that political parties, a number of them, for the first time seem to have very, very prominent queer political platforms. The Gao Gai, or its early incarnation in the previous election, had some queer identified people and queer rights issues for its platform. But it's not only Gao Gai, now it's Thai and other political parties have been talking about queer issues as well. So I think that question is very, very interesting, that the change from Thailand as having, in a sense, a more tolerant and also a very visible commercial gay scene, for example, but not having a very, very big political movement. It's no longer the case. We now have both, in a sense, a very, very vibrant commercial scene and an increasingly vibrant and dynamic and very vocal political discourses and political organisation that mainstream media and mainstream political forces are taking notice of for the first time. So it's beginning to have an impact politically as well. It hasn't had an impact yet because we don't have a new government to change the laws, but one would think whatever government forms, it seems to have been the platform of a number of parties to bring in a number of marriage equality or status recognition issues. So it seems that Thailand's becoming important in that as well. Just as a coda, as a comment on that, Thailand's not just important for Thailand, that in the context of anti-gay, anti-trans movements in Indonesia, for example, and in Malaysia and other places in the region, even in China, maybe under Xi Jinping, China began to have a flourishing gay, trans community culture until about 5 or 6 years ago, in Shanghai, Beijing, etc. But there's been a major crackdown as part of all sorts of things happening in China more recently. Bangkok and Thailand more broadly, in a sense, is a safe zone for people from a whole range of countries in the region who often come here not just as tourists, but often come here in a sense to find a safe space to be gay or queer or trans. So that what happens in Thailand is not just important, yes, it's important for here, but it has an importance beyond the borders of this country more broadly. And so there's a broader imagination, a broader imaginary of the importance of this place and what takes place here for queer rights broadly across East and Southeast Asia as well.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, you have one more question? Maybe you could have a mic. Oh, sorry, I didn't see. Yes, we'll come back to you in a second.
Oh,
Don't you put your hand up? No, sorry.
I actually do have a question. I had to put my hand up, but hi, I'm Connor. I'm a PhD student in anthropology at Emory University. First of all, great presentation. Thank you very much. So a question that I had overall, something that I was wondering is, given the myriad of different local gender identities that you have here in Thailand, do you notice any particularities or differences or trends when it comes to members of these communities, such as Toms or Katoi or gay men who engage in practices such as spirit mediumship?
No, can we have the mic here so we can?
It's actually not exactly a question. It's points and questions. First of all, I felt there was a little bit of a contradiction in the portrayal of the transgender media. You first portrayed it as an urban phenomenon. And later on, you pointed out how they replaced the medium old women in the village and moved from village to village. Now, this actually reminded me of something else that I just want to share, because I'm mainly in the home furnishing, the textile business. I dealt with silk, and I recently found out that somebody was producing certain yarns of silk in Thailand, the warps. And I talked to her and in a retreat somewhere, and she actually told me that a lot of the weavers of silk in the countryside, there's a lot of katois or trans who, when they get older, and I heard the question of what happens to them when they got older. I mean, some people say they all die, but she said a lot of them, they like to actually come and they become self-weavers in different places, and they try to turn it into fashion. And the last thing, again, it's not a question, or maybe it is, the last comment about Thailand and the safe space and the fact that there's this maneuverability here, kind of throws it back to the old 1960s theory of Thailand as a loose society. And it's a theory that says that Thailand, the society is supposed to be very rigid and hierarchical, but actually it is not. And it's been repudiated, but it kind of brings you back to just observation.
Thanks, Colin. I don't have a completely clear answer because I'm still looking into it. I'm more aware the literature, more people have done research on trans woman identified mediums than other identities, it seems to me. Trans women seem to have got prominent research focus in some ways, whereas trans men or tomboys or lesbians are not very prominent. And I don't know whether that's because they aren't as prominent in these cults, or is this that as academics we haven't been looking for them. You know, so I think partly that the certain identities have got more prominence in the academic literature than others. But that may be a not accurate reflection of the actual numbers of people and what they're actually doing. So that's, I think there's a need for more research to be done on that. But coming back more broadly, when you mentioned about the dynamism of identity categories, and I think that's still the case. So it's only in the last few years that the trans man category, for example, has become more clearly defined or more clearly expressed in Thailand. The notion of trans men has been in Western cultures for a couple of decades or so, whereas in a sense a clear community of people identified as trans men has only emerged much more recently here, in distinction from lesbian or whatever. So that's an interesting element there. I think there's a contradiction because I'm finding new things as I go along. So The book Deities and Divas was really based on my research up until about 3 or 4 years ago. It takes a while for books to get published. And I was really oriented at my contacts and my information and my own work was much more urban at that point. And when I asked people who, I hadn't gone out to the countryside myself at that point, and but COVID happened and it was difficult to do, but people I was just talking to said, well, there seems to be more in middle class or whatever. And, a colleague of mine is now in America was doing research on urban spirit cults in Bangkok, and so it was very, very, and they'd been here since the 1990s, so in a sense it was old by in terms of cultural form. It was 30 years old here. Whereas more recently I've been able to do more travelling, and I'm also collaborating with colleagues in northeast Thailand and the north. And just last week I was in Nakhon Phanom in northeast Thailand, and a colleague there took me to a village where there was a trans spirit medium, and she'd been there for 30, 40 years, in a very remote village. So yeah, I'm needing to reform. My ideas keep changing as more data becomes available. So I think we just don't know the answer to some of these questions until we get out there and do the research.
I said contradiction as a problem.
Yeah. And coming back to loose structure. Yeah. Yes and no. I mean, if you going back to gender, I mean, coming back to these type of performances, I mean, there's no very loose structure to a Thai beauty contest. That if you want to get first prize in a Thai beauty contest, you have to conform to certain sorts of norms of feminine beauty, and that's not very loosely structured at all. So I think it depends on where you're looking. And Thailand, it's this sort of question. It was an incomplete picture even back in the 1960s when it was put forward, and it was just, I think it was comparing Japan and Thailand, and I think it depends on what domain of culture you're talking about, because certainly even in the West we might be very loose about some things, but not about others.
Right.
And it seems to me that different cultures emphasize conformity in some domains more than others. And I think that argument about loose structure was, in a sense, simply not taking the fact that Thailand versus the West versus Japan emphasize structure or conformity in certain domains, but not always in the same domain across cultures. And that you can be flexible here, but not there, for example. And so I always thought that, for example, that when it comes to discourse, that argument, that loose structure, really didn't analyze how people speak in Thailand. So that the enunciation, the speaking of gender in discourse, the pronoun one uses, the particles one uses, even whatever, there are masculine ways of speaking and feminine ways of speaking, which are quite fixed in some ways. And I think that whole argument would have been different if you looked at what people actually say in Thailand and how structure is enforced almost the way through discourse. Just on that point, I remember years ago a colleague who was studying a PhD in Australia, and we were just having, as PhD students 40 years ago, we were chatting away and suddenly the conversation changed from English to Thai. And the person who was a feminist, suddenly she started speaking Thai, and suddenly the whole body language changed. That she was having to do ka, and di-chan, and so I really felt that the change of discursive representation, that once you start speaking Thai, it isn't just the words, it's a whole other body of formativity comes into play in order to do that. So I think that's just a broader observation.
Thank you. You really put it for me in really clear.
Peter, just, we have one more?
Yeah. We have time for one more. Hi, I'm Marcus. I'm a PhD student at Yale doing history. Thank you so much, Professor Jackson, for the talk. So I have two questions. So as a history student, I'm curious about your initial work in kind of Buddhist history or mainstream Buddhist history, and then kind of turn to perhaps the more anthropological or sociological work. And I'm wondering if there was a kind of methodological continuity here. If you're still taking a historical method or perspective into doing the current work that you're doing, or are you trying to historicize these trends in a way Thai context. And the second question I have is that you mentioned that a lot of these cults are urban cults. And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate more on the spatiality of these cults. You mentioned marketplaces like Chatuchak, and also private homes. I'm just wondering how, where do these cults take place, and what spatial relations are there, and how they relate to the city? Yeah, thank you.
I began as a philosopher, so Buddhist philosophy was my PhD. I think I was the first philosophy student in my department to get to do field work because I needed to come to Thailand to find the books to do it. But here, as a graduate student in philosophy, doing my early work, meeting other Western graduate and Thai graduate students, most of the graduate students were anthropologists at that time. So I'm talking 1982, 83. It may still be the case today. And just going out to dinner together or whatever, and talking about our research over dinner. And I remember, I forget what I was saying, talking about Buddhism or making generalizations that are about Thailand. And then all these anthropologists suddenly say, "You can't say that, Peter. You have to contextualize it. You have to say, you have to give the cultural context to whatever the discursive form is." I mean, okay, whatever. Around that time, my work on gay issues was all happened by serendipity. It was just, there were transgender people in the marketplace, and I found these strange, the book that became Dear Uncle Go was just like finding, going to a barber shop and finding this magazine, reading this magazine while I was waiting to have my hair cut. It looked like an ordinary magazine. It had this whole column with gay, Lonely Hearts column in the middle. I thought, God, this is interesting. So I just started collecting it and putting that together and talking about that and talking with colleagues that the only way to analyse, I was trained in discourse analysis, text analysis. So I began working with the texts that were available, with letters from gay men to a Lonely Hearts column or gay magazines when they were published in the early 1980s. But I was bringing, in a sense, the insights from my anthropological colleagues to the context. So in order to interpret or to read those texts, I was trying to bring to it, in a sense, of cultural reading. And then when it came to time getting a job, there were no jobs in Buddhist philosophy in Australia. But there were jobs in Thai history and whatever. So I had to reformulate myself from a philosopher to a historian, and then from a historian to a cultural historian, and then when I retire, you don't have to put yourself in a pigeonhole anymore. So most of my collaborations at the present are with anthropologists and sociologists. But I'm still interested in text, so I'm working on a project which is taking ages to do. Every academic's got things they've never written about, but I'm trying to put together some 19th century texts and what queer lens can be brought to them to talk about something from the Chulalongkorn period, in the period when the West is just arriving, and that point of time, that point of intersection. So it'll be a couple of years before that's ready to do anything further. Your other point on the spatiality of this, I think it depends on the cult. So, for example, with Guan Yin or Ganesh, for example, you can find Mahayana, you can find temples for Guan Yin, you can find shrines to Ganesh, dedicated places, but sometimes you can also find little shrines that within mainstream Buddhist monasteries. And often those little shrines have been donated by followers. So somebody who is making merit, or a layperson who is going to a particular monastery may have a particular association or a feeling of closeness to Ganesh or to Guan Yin or to whatever. And so often they make a donation to allow a particular little shrine to be built within the space of a Theravada monastery for that particular owner. So other side, like with Hindu, like what's called the Sri Mariamman temple, the Tamil temple on Silong, or what would you call it in Thai? A very important site for a whole range of not just Indian Thais, but for Thais interested in Hindu deities. And the annual rituals of Navaratri, the 9 nights, which corresponds to the same period as the Chinese festival, or the Chinese vegetarian festival. But every year, Thai spirit mediums for Hindu deities assemble at Wat Kat as a spiritual location, so that when the images of the deities are brought out from Wat Kat onto Silong Road, they in a sense re-energize or re-spiritualize the images of the deities which are brought there by followers from around the country. So it's interesting. I mean, the sexuality question is very, very interesting. But also the other element is that with media, with whatever, a lot of this has gone on the internet. So I haven't talked about the new hit word, modelo. There's this new, the last 2 or 3 years, there's been this other term for talking about magic phenomena or things which make like good lucky charms or whatever. And I think most of that is during COVID. There's been a tremendous digitalization of that. So when life had to go online during COVID, so did magic in a big way. So I think that the next stage of research, and I don't have time to go on the internet and do it, but there's a whole range of projects to do about how what I've been talking about has gone online and now exists in virtual spaces in ways that it can also get beyond the borders of Thailand, where the followers of these cults can now be from Taiwan or Hong Kong or Singapore or Berkeley, California or wherever. So there's a really interesting range of things that are going on in that domain as well.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. If anyone would like to. Otherwise, I have a question. I'm just wondering, also following on what now our friends asked before about older transgender people. I wonder if your research, or if you're aware of other research relevant to what we're talking about, whether this issue of age has been looked at, and what role does it play in the visibility, for example, of transgender people or gay men who engage in this type of rituals and activities, and whether there is any awareness at all, or there is any, because from my perspective, Thai society is very ageist in many ways. And I wonder if this is reflected here.
I think it is, and I think, I've also asked myself the question, where do older gay men go? They don't just die, many of them go home. Home is the original village or whatever. There's very little social security in this country, so that if you haven't bought an apartment or whatever in Bangkok in the years that you've been working, where do you go? You have to go back to the family home or with the relatives when you get older. I don't think that's for everybody, but I think that's often happening. But I think there's a whole project out there that hasn't yet been done on aging and gender diversity. So where do older people go? What sort of support networks do they have? Some of them try to stay in Bangkok, but others go back. So they don't only become silk weavers. I think some of them just with their savings go back and whatever, sell flowers or exactly. Yeah, but I think it's an interesting question, and so many of the people that I've met and got to know over the last 20 or 30 years, NGO people working in various cultural performances, very few of them were born in Bangkok. Very few. So the people who are now in their 40s, 50s or whatever came to Bangkok for studies when they were young or whatever. A lot of them haven't quite yet thought through where they're going to go when they turn 60 or 65 and they stop working. But I think it's an interesting question. And I think there's a whole issue about aging and gender diversity that still would be worked out to answer that sort of question. I think informally some people are going back to their villages. Others have used their money to buy a house for mum and dad back in the village. So it's been cheaper to buy a home back in the home village than it is in Bangkok as an investment for the future. So that maybe brothers and sisters are living there now, but maybe when I get old or they get old, then they can go back and live there as well. So I think that these family networks still exist in some ways, and I think that with the changing structure of the family, with fewer children being born, but whatever, the aging of Thai society is not just a gay or transgender issue. It's a broader issue as well, and I think it's going to be an ongoing one that we'll probably have to have much more research done on in the future as well.
I wonder if anyone else would like to. You still have one more? Sure. We have 5 minutes, so please.
It's a short one, but it just popped into my head. Because, I read your book, Capitalism Magic Thailand, totally fascinated by it. But, when I look at what's going on politically now, and the young generation, or actually so much, I'm from Israel originally, 40 years ago, and like I look at the young generation of Thailand, and I'm so enthused about this young generation compared to Israel. Wow, they're much better, they're so forward-looking, really. Where does this generation fit in with that? I mean, I would love to research it. Just wondering.
It's a question in my mind as well. I mean, I wonder whether there are more younger people who people don't use the word atheism in Thailand, but people who don't go to temples or don't worry about making merit, these sorts of things. I think that is part of it. But there are still lots and lots of young people who go to pray to Ganesh for good results for their exams, who are young people who are into amulets, and maybe they don't have the amulets of their mother and father, but they have another particular amulet. So I'm not quite sure the answer. It means something. It needs another young person to go out and interview young people to get the answer to that. But I think it's sort of an open question. But I think it's interesting you ask that, because it seems to me that where people keep asking this Weberian question, oh, when's Thailand going to stop being superstitious? You know, are the young people going to stop believing in this? But I mean, I've been coming here for 40 years. People asked that to me 40 years ago. You know, and the students of that generation are now the ones who are following Ramatafai or whatever. So, you know, and I kept waiting for the amulets to go away. They never went away, you know. So I waited 20 years to write that book because I was expecting, following, you know, not just Weber, but following Western theory, that, you know, when Thailand reached a certain level, blah, blah, it would all disappear. No way. No way.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I think we have come to the end of our event today. So I would like all of us to thank Professor Peter Jackson. Thank you. I want to thank all of you here, all of you watching on social media. I would like to remind you, on behalf of the Junction, please support the Junction any way you can, with donations, by disseminating the information about the Junction. Thank you very much. Continue to follow the Junction. And I think I also would like to thank the Junction staff here. Please let's thank them for their support. The books of Professor Jackson are there if you want to purchase them also. And please, there are some light refreshments that the Junction staff have prepared. So thank you so much. See you next time. Goodbye.